Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Change Wired podcast. I'm your host, Angela Shurina, your behavioral science and behavioral change obsessed executive coach, culture transformation and change leadership consultant, someone who is truly in love with the process of change, of getting better, of moving forward, and figuring out how we all can unlock more of our potential and do our absolute best. Today, guys, I am very excited because we have another amazing guest on the show, Dr. Brooke. Brooke is the founder and principal facilitator of Converge, a consultancy that helps leadership teams transform strategy into culture, into observable behavior and desired results using his Align, Commit, Transform framework. With a PhD in the philosophy of science, Brooke is globally recognized voice in applied decision and behavioral science. He served as a research director at the Decision Lab, hosted their podcast, The Decision Corner, which I'm a huge fan of and was really sad when they stopped releasing podcast episodes. Brooke has been featured in Forbes, Bloomberg, Vox, Globe and Mail, and other publications. Brooke specializes in helping mid-sized organizations navigate strategic points of change by embedding decision-making processes that scale leadership, distribute authority, and turn uncertainty into strategic advantage and results. On today's podcast, guys, among other things, we're going to talk about how the way many organizations make decisions is actually the biggest barrier to their change. We're going to talk about hidden flaw in most evidence-based decision-making, why success might be misleading you and us more towards failure, what confidence looks like in the age of AI and uncertainty where everything is changing all the time, how to build a culture that doesn't mind hard truths but leans into them and works through them. We're going to talk about a real role of leadership when decisions can no longer be centralized and certain, and a lot more. So without further ado, I invite you to tune in, stay tuned, and then talk about the podcast with Brooke. So let's dive in. Thank you for joining me on Change Wired podcast, the show where we talk about all shades and sides of change leadership, change management, personal and collective transformation. So we grow, unlock more of our potential, and create a better world. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, that's so amazing to connect with you. I've been following your work in one way or the other for quite some time right now. It's the Decision Lab, and then I found Behavioral Corner podcast or Decision Corner.
Decision Corner.
Decision Corner. Yeah, I listened to a lot of the episodes, so I feel like I'm listening to the voice that I've listened for hours already. So it's so cool to connect here, Brooke. I always ask my guests to do a little bit of a self-introduction, what it is you'd like our listeners to know about you, about your work before we jump into our conversation so they have the right kind of context.
Sure. So thank you for having me on. Thank you for giving me a little bit of space to share some ideas. Always a pleasure to exchange with you and to share those insights with audiences. A bit of background about me. So I got very interested in organizational decision-making about 10 years ago now, maybe a little bit more. Very interested in evidence-based policy and evidence-based decision-making. And probably 3 or 4 years into that journey, I realized that thinking about organizations as decision makers was useful in some ways, but I also needed to be thinking about people making decisions in organizational contexts. And that's really what brought me into behavioral science, decision science, and ultimately to the Decision Lab and to becoming the host of the Decision Corner podcast. Fast forward a couple of years, the Decision Lab had grown already and was continuing to grow. And what I saw was that I really wanted to come back to those roots of organizational decision making, especially in the context of leadership. I wanted to get
Mm-hmm.
into conversations around strategy and around organizational culture to improve the decisions of people inside of organizations rather than primarily working on decisions of citizens or consumers or stakeholders, the people
Mm-hmm.
that organizations affect externally. And so that was about the time that I founded Converge, which I've been running for about 3 years now. And that's really focused on strategy development, organizational culture development. And to your point earlier, there's like a personal growth, leadership development aspect to that as well. That's really come to the fore in the work that I've been doing in the last few years. It wasn't something that I was expecting initially,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's really become a prominent feature of what it is that I'm working on now.
Yeah, I think because at the end of the day, it's all about people making decisions, growing, changing their behavior, right? And if I read it somewhere, if you can't understand the change on a small scale of individual, you can't really understand change at the bigger scale.
Right.
Because yeah, at the end, we are as collectives consist of individuals who are influenced by, I don't know, circumstances, environments, and histories and whatnot. You mentioned so many things that I want to sort of open up a little bit. Like, I think the first thing you mentioned, evidence-based. Can you explain to
Yeah.
our listeners what is evidence-based and maybe what it's compared to and how it is different?
Right. So evidence is a thorny thing. So my PhD is in the philosophy of science. So I have a lot of things to say about evidence. And what I'll say now is maybe just like kind of a caveat to that is only a few of those things that I'll say about evidence are at all interesting to people who are not philosophers. So
Hmm.
I'll put a bit of a bracket around that and say when we talk about evidence-based, usually what we're talking about is information, data, which can be quantitative or qualitative, that's gathered using a defined and consistent methodology. Let me
Hmm.
put it that way. Often that will be contrasted to intuitions or
Hmm.
values. Like there's a very, very, I think, superficial level at which people say, well, evidence and knowledge on the one hand is juxtaposed against like superstition and bad ideas on the other hand, which I don't think is all that helpful. I also don't think that it's helpful to draw a hard division between facts and values because values go into methodological choices about how we gather evidence. Even the
Hmm.
choice of which evidence we gather versus which evidence we don't gather, like that is a values laden decision. A lot of people might want to push back against that, saying, like, well, if values are involved in evidence collection, then you're losing objectivity.
Hmm.
Again, there's a lot of potentially not all that interesting stuff that I can say about that, but there are some people who really like to go down that rabbit hole and I can enjoy following them. But maybe this podcast is not the space for that. So
Hmm.
the distinction that I want to draw instead is more about how we engage in conversations about evidence. So
Hmm.
when we think about the decisions of which evidence to gather and which not to, who gets to participate in those decisions? Who gets to
Hmm.
participate in those conversations? That I think is a very important point. When we are looking at the evidence that we've gathered and trying to interpret that evidence and figure out what it's trying to tell us, who gets to participate in that conversation? This conversation
Hmm.
around meaning making. That's really important. It's important from an inclusion perspective. And I don't just mean like kind of this superficial, like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's just the
Hmm.
right thing to do. Like, again, I think that those narratives are not that helpful. There's a real point here around like making collective decisions and committing to those collective decisions. If people feel that their voices aren't heard in a conversation, they are much less likely to commit to the outcomes of those conversations. And here we see the behavioral tie back right away,
Yeah.
right? If people are involved, if people feel that they have contributed to a conversation, that their voice has been heard, that their perspectives have been integrated, they feel a sense of ownership over the outcome of that conversation. And therefore, they will have a higher degree of commitment to the outcome of that conversation. And so that's something that I bring even into the evidence gathering and evidence interpretation conversation. Like, we need to involve those people that we want committed to the outcome in the
Hmm.
process of reaching that outcome.
Hmm. Yes. That also what it makes me think is when we talk about evidence-based, it sounds like it feels like it's more about predetermined sequence and process of decision making
Mm.
versus what's not evidence-based. It's more like, okay, we're doing this, but it feels like we should pivot. And when you ask people to explain that decision, they don't really have a clear answer, like how they came to that conclusion. And so for me,
So,
that's kind of the main difference.
yeah, so evidence is an interesting thing in this, right? Because a lot of people will say, well, we should pivot because of this data point, right?
Yeah.
And unless you peel back the layers and look at how that decision was made, that can look like a very rational decision making process on the surface. Oh, this person is making a decision based on a data point. The
Hmm.
challenge is that there's so much evidence out there, there's so much data out there. Once you have reached a conclusion, it is not difficult to go and find data that supports the conclusion that
Yeah.
you want to
Yeah, that
support.
confirmation bias.
Exactly. And this is not something that's done intentionally. It's not malevolent. It's not, bad spirited or anything like this. It's just like it's our cognitive hardwiring to go and seek information that reinforces our existing beliefs. We can do it completely with the best of intentions, that we go out and
Hmm.
find more and more evidence that supports the perspective that we already hold. The thing for me that makes evidence based really, really powerful is to align as a group through the process, not on this is the outcome that we think is the best, and
Hmm.
now we're going to go and collect evidence. Rather, this is the approach to evidence collection that we think is going to give us the most robust answer. And we pre-commit ourselves to say, now we're going to go out and collect that evidence, and we
Hmm.
are going to follow what that evidence tells us. And that commitment to methodology rather than outcome
Yeah.
is a really important distinction.
Yes, that's exactly, what I understand about evidence-based is committing to the methodology, to the process, and being sort of not attached to the outcome at all. And it's like, in scientific method, you're not right until, well, you are wrong until you prove the opposite.
Yeah.
And so that, yeah, the whole point is to not commit to any outcome and then try to prove it, but instead have a methodology and then see what comes out of it.
And that has a huge personal growth aspect to it as well. Like it is uncomfortable to do that. It feels very counterintuitive. It feels very exposing. It feels full of risk, all of which is true.
Oh.
And yet we will still reach better decisions and we will achieve stronger commitment to those decisions as a group if we follow this process as opposed to following a different one.
Yeah. And do you think in our today's world where also change is accelerated and I guess there is a lot more data and it also changes at a faster pace. Do you think evidence-based still holds the same like power when again, it seems like data points and what we collect changes just every time we collect it?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that working in an evidence-based manner continues to be relevant, continues to be important, perhaps more so than ever. What needs to be calibrated is our patience, our appetite for risk. Like we might need to be comfortable, and maybe I'll make a stronger statement. As things continue to move faster around us, we need to become more and more comfortable making decisions on less evidence than we might want. We
Hmm.
will not feel as reassured. The evidence will not be as conclusive as we might want it to be. We might not feel as comfortable with the decision at the moment when we say, well, we have to jump now or not, right? Whatever choice we're going to make, leap or don't leap, we will probably have to make that on the basis of less evidence than we would want, with a feeling of greater discomfort than we might prefer.
Hmm. And that actually brings me to a very important point that you mentioned in one of your articles or podcasts around, well, okay, now that we have less data and we need to act on with less certainty, like if you are a leader in charge of, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, how are you supposed to like look confident and share this confidence or show this confidence to people and then ask them to leap and to act when you actually don't know how it's going to turn out?
Yeah. So I would challenge the idea that we need to show confidence, or that the way that we typically think about showing confidence is the right way to lead right now. I think
Mm-hmm.
that right now, the type of confidence that is called for is the confidence to say, I don't know, the confidence
Mm-hmm.
to not only acknowledge ignorance, but embrace it and actually structure our leadership around that ignorance. To say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I want you to be making these leaps. As the team around me, I need you to be making these leaps. And we need to make that safe both for the organization and for the individuals. And for that reason, we set up very specific kind of guardrails about how large a leap can be at first until it
Mm-hmm.
demonstrates a certain level of credibility, at which point we invest a little bit further and down delegating those decisions and saying, we know that there are just more choices that need to be made inside of this organization than can be centralized and made in the C-suite. And therefore, these are the range of decisions that we are down delegating. And here's guidance about how we would like you to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to support you in making those decisions. Like, we're not making it clear that we're not rewarding on the basis of outcomes, we're rewarding on the basis of process.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the best decision possible still turns out badly. And so
Yeah.
making sure, and the flip side is also true. Sometimes bad decisions still
Right.
turn out well. And so making sure that like we are really being thorough about the process. When something doesn't work, what we want to look at is how good was the decision making process? Did you make the best decision available to you at the time?
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing is true of success. This is something that I believe it's the US Marines are very like explicit about. They do an after action review. Like, as soon as a mission is complete, they do a review immediately, whether the mission was a failure or a success. And
Mm-hmm.
that is really, really key here. Like, they're hyper focused on process. What were the decisions that were made? How were those decisions made? How might we improve the decision making process moving forward, even in situations where everything turned out exactly the way that we'd hoped or pretty close?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned this, insight that I think I first read in a book by Annie Duke, either Thinking in Bats or something around decision making, and it was so the profound for me to understand that yes, even a good outcome might be a result of bad thinking or bad decision making, and it's true the other way around as well. Bad outcome might be the result of good decision making. And so we really need to understand like the process of decision making itself, not judge just the results, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
like also there is this personal bias. Well, if I succeeded, I don't need to look into that. So it's all good. So let me just move forward. And when you fail, you kind of stop and start thinking again, where did it go wrong? Whereas like, yeah, if you did succeed, you also need to analyze how did you end up having that success.
Yeah, I want to loop back to confidence in that context and personal growth that comes with that. Like, how can we be confident in the face of many decisions that turn out poorly? Let's think about venture capital, for instance. Part of the
Yeah.
model is they want to be taking bets on such big gambles that they know that the vast majority of them should fail. If the failure rate is too low, that's actually an indicator that they're not taking enough risk in their portfolio. How do we maintain confidence in the face of so much failure? I think the solution to that is to really revisit what confidence means in this context. It's the confidence to say, even though a situation turned out poorly, this is this is information, this is feedback, this is evidence for me to think about how it is that I'm working. And that takes an enormous amount of personal growth to take
Mhm.
ego out of the equation. Your outcomes are a reflection of your process, not of you as a person. And
Yeah.
therefore, on the one hand, when there are failures, like, this is not a personal attack.
Mm.
Product launch failing is not a reflection of your value as a person. Similarly, when something goes well, this is also not a reflection of your value as a person. Like
Yeah.
recognizing that actually the feedback that the market is giving us about different offerings is not about us. It's not a reflection on our value as individuals. And so that sense of confidence, that ability to step back from that feedback and say, I'm confident in my worth and in my value as
Hmm.
as a leader, as a contributor, as a person, as a family member, whatever that is. Like I'm confident enough in my value that I can look at this feedback, I can look at this information that I'm getting from the world around me and not be destabilized by that. I'm
Yeah.
confident enough to go and stare a hard truth in the face. And I'm confident enough to set up an organization that does the same thing, that stares into the hard truth and doesn't blink and doesn't flinch. And I'm willing to support the people around me in doing that as well, even when the results that they get are not the results that I hope for. But if they're following the right process and if they are learning, I have confidence that in the long term, the things that need to happen will happen. The results that we're looking for will come about, and I'm not destabilized by it in the short term. That to me is a
Hmm.
very, very strong position of confidence for leadership that's well calibrated to the 21st century.
Yeah. And while you were speaking about that, I thought that this process has to be communicated and somehow transferred throughout the whole organization. What I found in my work also is that leaders sometimes assume that sort of everyone thinks this way because I once said it somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, we all got it. But well, repetition is a mother of all skill and it needs to be present in order for anything to sink in. And plus, there are new people coming, going, people leaving. And so it has to be repeated in so many ways and so many times. So it becomes part of culture, not just part of, if you, a leader's mindset at the top.
I would build on that. And so first of all, yes, I totally agree. Like you need to say something, or rather, you need to hear something 1,000 times before you really hear it for the first time.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. And your strongest communications are your actions. And
Mm.
so really demonstrating through your own behavior how it is that you are acting in this way, not just sending out nice communications, but also being transparent about the process that you yourself are following and modeling the behavior that you hope to see from others. Beyond this as well, embedding it into processes, embedding it into systems. The
Mhm.
way that we work, the structures that we set up to guide the actions that we take in our day-to-day work are so powerful in setting that organizational culture and in establishing that mindset that's shared around the organization. Culture change cannot be just a communications plan. It can't be those 4 or 5 words that you print in huge font on your walls. If that is the extent of your culture work, your cultural interventions, you will have very little impact on the organization that you're leading. This, for me, is why it's so important to have culture so tightly integrated with strategy and to have, from a role division perspective, something that I'm seeing more and more is that the organizations that are strongest on culture and really nailing it with strategy and being able to implement strategies and cascade those strategies effectively throughout their organizations, more and more I'm seeing that those are organizations where there's a strong relationship between the CEO and the chief people officer or the chief HR officer.
Mm.
When that happens, we get past culture as communications. It's not, culture is not just something that is managed inside of the HR function. Culture is more strongly determined by our actions than any words that we might say. And the actions that an organization takes are cutting across all functions. We need to think about operations. We need to think about marketing and sales. We need to think about every function inside of the organization as a lever that influences culture. And this is where that tight relationship between the head of HR and the CEO is very
Mm.
important, because if the CEO takes the perspectives of the culture leader seriously, there will be opportunities for those cultural interventions to really cascade across the functions of the organization. If HR is in its box and needs to stay in its lane and doesn't have
Mhm.
serious attention from the other executives, almost by its nature, we know that cultural interventions are going to have a very, very weak effect.
Yeah, so culture, yeah, I again read it somewhere. Culture is not what we say, but what we repeatedly do. And
Yeah.
words are always easier, right, than to take action. And also, what you made me think about when we want to promote certain behavior, it's not just example, it's also to a huge degree of what we incentivize, what we praise people for, what we make public and draw everyone's attention to. It's what's the easiest, right? And that goes actually to behavioral change and design for behavioral change. It's like I always use this phrase, cultivate workplaces where human potential growth. What for me, it's always been true that when you create the space for certain things and behaviors to flourish, that's what's going to happen. It's yeah, and when I say what you communicate, what I mean communication, yes, it's not just words, it's also actions, it's also example, it's also what bonuses are given for, it's also what is praised, and yeah, what's made easier. Do you
Yeah,
have
we don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to
yeah.
the level of our systems.
Yes, and that's kind of, I feel like the breach. I always, when I think of your work, I think of design for behavioral change, but also think of decision making. And I feel like they are very interlinked. The decisions we make influence our behaviors directly, and those decisions are shaped by everything around us. And that's
Yeah.
where also, yeah, go ahead. If you-
And the leadership and culture piece and the strategy piece are an important part of that as well. The reason that I really focus on that space is that the decisions that are made at those leadership tables, once they are cascaded through all the systems of the organization, are an
Mhm.
enormously powerful lever for change. So if we think about, for instance, the like massive explosion of interest in behavioral science during the COVID pandemic, one of the things that I saw in that is that the the heightened attractiveness of behavioral science and decision science at that time was in large part driven by the idea that we didn't need to change policies, we didn't need to change regulations, we didn't need to change legislation in order to change behavior. It was like
Mhm.
we get to change behavior, we get to have more of the outcomes that we want without doing the hard work of actually changing regulations, policies, these kinds of things. That I think is really problematic. The idea that we should just like relinquish and abandon this conversation about good leadership in order to move to the right behaviors. Like,
Hmm.
I think that the leadership conversation is one that we need to not abandon. We need leadership conversations now more than we have needed them in a very long time. I think we're in a bit of a crisis of leadership. We don't see a lot of good leadership around us right now. And so I'm really like flipping the thing on its head and saying, yes, all these tools of behavioral science and decision science, they're extremely powerful and we should use them. And the place where we should start is with ourselves, especially
Mhm.
as leaders.
Can you expand on this a little bit more? What do you mean? How do we marry, so to speak, behavioral science and leadership? Where do you see leaders maybe lack or need to incorporate those? And what would be maybe like the example, maybe through specific behaviors of good leadership
Yeah.
married with behavioral science?
So if I think about this in a policy context, a lot of conversations in behavioral science in a policy context are focused on how we can get citizens to access a program more. How can we
Hmm.
get them to take advantage of a benefits program more than they currently are? And this often gets reduced to communications. We think
Hmm.
about communication or we think about behavioral science and that whole toolkit as a comms toolkit. We will be
Hmm.
able to better communicate the value of the program in a more timely way, et cetera, to improve uptake and adherence to program X. That's, I would say, like the thin interpretation of how behavioral science can help us to improve policy. One step deeper than that is to say, okay, well, behavioral science actually can tell us a lot about why people are not adhering to this program. And it might not just be that you haven't communicated benefits clearly or in a timely way, or that you don't have very polished and smooth UX. The
Hmm.
problem might be that actually the program is not very well designed for the people that it's supposed to be helping the most. And
Hmm.
so the next layer there is to say, okay, we're going to use behavioral science for messaging and we're going to use it for program design. We're
Hmm.
not just going to message a program differently, we're going to design a program differently. And that is already a much bigger task than just changing communications. Like the
Hmm.
number of people inside of an agency or department who need to sign off on comms changes is relatively small compared to the number of people who need to sign off on a change in program design itself.
Hmm.
So that's kind of a second layer. A third layer then is to say, okay, well, how is it that we are making decisions internally about how to structure these programs? How is it that we arrived in a situation where the messaging around the program is not as effective as we'd want it to be, and actually the program design is not as effective as we want it to be? Oh, it turns out that those were the very predictable outcomes of the decision-making processes that we've set up inside of our organization. And if we continue to make decisions about comms, decisions about program design in the way that we've been making them, we should expect that we will continue to get the kinds of outcomes that we're getting now. So that's the third layer. And then the fourth layer is like at the leadership level. How is it that I'm leading inside of this organization that makes these kinds of decision making processes the most likely ones to come up? Why
Okay.
is it that the way that I talk about and the way that I demonstrate my relation to uncertainty, my relation to risk and fear and these kinds of things, how is it that I, as a leader, showing up day after day, behaving in these ways, is creating an organization where nobody can talk about risk openly, nobody can really undertake effective experiments because everything needs to be a success.
Hmm.
Nothing is allowed to fail, and therefore we have no space in which to learn.
Hmm.
What is it that I'm doing as a leader showing up day after day that's creating that kind of circumstance? Because that ultimately flows all the way down the cascade. If I change
Yeah.
my leadership behaviors, that will change the kind of culture and the kinds of systems and processes that we have inside of our organization, which will change the kinds of programs that we design, the kinds of communications that we design in order to convey the right message to the right people at the right time, et cetera, which ultimately leads to the kinds of behaviors and outcomes that we're looking to generate through our policy.
Yeah, it reminds me of this phrase, every system is perfectly optimized to get the result it's getting.
Absolutely.
It's like,
So, yeah, I'm 100% on board. Systems thinking is a big part of how I think about and try to interact with the world. I think about what it is that makes outcomes so consistent. I remember I
hmm.
went to a talk about 6 months ago, and it was a very respected economist who was giving this presentation about how certain geopolitical dynamics were expected to change and macroeconomic changes that were coming from that. And I asked specifically, this was in a Canadian context, I'm based in Canada for any listeners who
Hmm.
don't know, thinking about the productivity gap. So, like, for
Hmm.
decades and decades and decades, productivity per employee in Canada has been chronically lower than productivity for analogous workers in the United States, in
Hmm.
European countries, etc. And so I asked, well, what about that productivity gap that's just been this like glaring problem for decades? What is driving that? And how do we expect that to change? And the economist's answer was, well, there's nothing really driving that. And I pushed back. And to your point around like a system is optimized to produce the outcomes that it generates
Yeah.
consistently. Like if things don't have a reason, they're random. They fluctuate like crazy. If we see a consistent, stable outcome, it's because there is a reason underneath that that is driving that consistency. And so we got into a conversation about, what it is about the history of Canadian economy. It was a very interesting conversation
Hmm.
that has produced this productivity gap. But that broader point is a very, very strong one. If there is an outcome that you're seeing that you consistently don't like, it's because of some feature of the system design that you are seeing that consistency. So the real question to ask, for me anyway, is seldom like, how can I convince people to behave differently? It's more,
Hmm.
what am I doing already that is convincing people to behave in the way that they're behaving now? Because that's the thing that I will need to change. And often the power of that completely blows out of the water what we will do with just a communications shift.
Yeah, so it's, again, such a powerful concept, and it's powerful for changing organizations and collectives and governments, and also for personal change, right? Everyone's life is optimized for the result that the person is getting. And so if you want something different, well, you got to look at what your life is optimized for and how to change those different factors so you get the different result, right? That's why
Yeah.
often like just changing location would often produce different results, even if you change nothing else. But
And
yeah,
there are two questions that I find really powerful in that respect for leaders. One is, why is the continuation of the status quo not acceptable?
mm,
Why is the same result 12 months from now, 24 months from now, not totally fine and totally adequate? Because
hmm
if there isn't discomfort with those results, there will not be sufficient motivation for change.
hmm
That's one. And the second question is, what are the ways in which I am benefiting from and complicit in the outcomes that I
hmm
say that I don't want?
yeah,
Because often there is also a benefit that comes from that. So if we think about, for instance, like, oh, I want more innovation inside of my organization, I want people taking more risk, but I myself as a leader, I don't take any risk. And when I have failures or I have experiments that don't turn out the way that I had hoped that they would turn out, I don't share those things. I only share success stories. Like, how is it that I'm benefiting from that? Well,
hmm
it's allowing me to shield my ego
yeah,
and coming to terms with the fact that there are real benefits that each of us is getting from the circumstances that we're participating in that we say that we don't like. And so I talked about this question earlier of like, why is continuation of the status quo not acceptable? That's to drive the motivation for change. The
hmm
reason the second question around like how I'm benefiting from the status quo is so important is basically like, well, to put it in grand terms, that comfort that you're enjoying, that benefit that you're enjoying from the status quo, like that's the thing that you're going to put up on the altar and sacrifice in the name of change.
yeah. It's like we all want innovation, but we all want innovation if we're winning in it. We're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
actually
yeah,
that
that's
happy
right.
when it gets messy. But before we actually get to a new sort of equilibrium or new status quo, there has to be mass, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And
Yep.
we often don't want this and get frustrated and upset. And also to the second point about status quo, it's yes, we humans are creatures of habit, and we don't like to be changing actually at the core when there is no reason. And that's why they say, change management is you gotta first communicate the urgency and the reason. Otherwise, nobody would want to change their behavior, would just try to keep things as they are as long as well, we can, right?
And to my point earlier, this is where like collective leadership for me is such a powerful intervention. Yes, it's very well received wisdom in the change management world that you need to communicate urgency. Putting my behavioral hat on, I want to step that up one further. It's not just about communicating urgency. It's about giving people the opportunity to define that urgency. Like one of the
Mhm.
challenges with communicating urgency to people who have not participated in a process of defining it is like what's urgent to you might not be urgent to them.
Yeah,
You might say, oh, well, it's super important that this change because in 18 months, this is going to happen. And if they don't care about this that's happening in 18 months, they will not be motivated to change. Having them participate in that process of like co-defining what that urgent situation is makes them
yeah.
so much more motivated to actually implement the changes that are needed because it's their change. It's not your change that is being imposed on them.
Yeah, so it's like, there is this also phrase in change management. I think it's was popularized by Prosai. What's in it for me? Like, and what's in it for me is different than what it is for the leader of organization. I often would talk to people who are, for some reason, about to retire. And like, they don't want change. They don't want to talk about change. They just want to
Of
peacefully
course.
retire. For them, there is literally nothing, and they're not the right people to talk about change. So yeah, you're so right. We are humans. We like to contribute, but we also are very selfish, and we need to not never forget about that. Speaking of change management, I also definitely wanted to touch upon a lot of change management that is happening right now due to AI and yeah, so all the transformation that is just happening in an ongoing fashion, and I always hear from leaders, well, we roll out one thing and it gets outdated. So should we do something? Should we just do nothing and wait for it? And also strategy. Does it make sense to do any strategy, or like, what's your take on that from the perspective of decision making and behavioral science? So what leaders should do in this situation?
Yeah. So, yes, I think that strategy is still relevant. I think that strategy as a process needs to accelerate. Like our strategy processes have been calibrated to a certain pace of decision making. As that pace of decision making has increased because of the increased pace of change around us, so too does the strategy process need to like rise to the challenge. It needs to meet the moment. And so thinking about strategy not as an exercise that you do annually or that you do every 3 years that is
Mm-hmm.
like this massive effort and undertaking where your entire leadership team is like basically out of commission for huge chunks of time. That I think is an ineffective way to be doing strategy moving forward. I think strategy needs to be smaller, faster, and more iterative. And this is where we start to see like a big connection between strategy and culture, where actually we are creating organizations that have a culture of thinking and acting strategically. This
Mm-hmm.
is I was talking a bit earlier in our conversation about the delegation of decision making. How is it that we can delegate that decision making effectively? I talked about giving clarity about the process of how you want decisions to be made and where the guardrails are and how performance is
Mm-hmm.
going to be assessed around that. There's also a big piece of like substantive context. This is the differentiated position. This is the competitive advantage that we want to be nurturing. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in making your decisions in these ways, we want you to be leaning into serving customers that look like this rather than segments over here, because those segments are ones where we don't feel that we can develop a sustainable competitive advantage. And developing these kinds of core capabilities, these differentiating capabilities inside of our organization, because we feel that those are the ones that are going to position us to win with this segment of clientele that we've selected, where we don't feel that competitors or other alternatives will really be able to dislodge us as the best choice for that competitor or for that clientele that we've selected.
Mm-hmm.
So really making that clear across the organization to guide the substantive direction of conversations. And again, to the point we were making earlier about uncertainty, about innovation, also clearly indicating these are the these are the elements of our strategy about which we have high certainty or high confidence. And these are the ones where we know that our strategy is full of assumptions, it's full of hypotheses, and so it's
Yeah.
very important for you across the organization to be escalating the signals that you're seeing from the marketplace, from our clientele, from our partners, from our funders, whoever those various stakeholder groups are. Like we have made bets about how to position ourselves strategically that rely on X and Y and Z being true.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know if they are. Part of what we need to do is actually build the evidence base that our strategic position is the right one for us to stake out. And so we need to know what it is that you're seeing, because it's always the frontline employees who have that most direct access to what signals the market is giving them, be that customers, be that partners and other stakeholders, right? So how can we create an organizational system and along with it the culture to make sure that those signals get escalated effectively
Mm-hmm.
so that we can meaningfully reflect on what it is that the world around us is telling us. Again, to that point of feedback and information and
Yeah.
taking ego out of the equation. Like, what is it that the world around us is trying to tell us about what we are trying to do? Which parts of it
Yeah.
do they like? Which parts of it do they not like? Are there client segments that are resonating really strongly with this that we had disqualified or that we had not considered that actually are showing real promise as places for us to go and play in the market, where we think that we can have a sustainable competitive advantage. Those kinds of insights are really the aggregate of a bunch of tiny signals that are being collected throughout the organization. So
Yeah.
to come back to this question about strategy, like strategy making is one that needs to be done on a much more continuous basis where we are
Hmm.
reflecting on those signals, where we're actively paying attention to what the world around us is trying to say to us so that we can make informed decisions about which direction to take.
Yeah. And also, there has to be a clear system for gathering that data, for gathering that feedback, for escalating it, for then making decisions, right? It's not something that you believe people should just get, but there has to be, again, an easier, very well communicated system, and it has to be reinforced in order for people to actually do it. And then you have to obviously measure it is actually happening, like this feedback loop, this information gathering or not. And if not, then what can we do about that? Also, throughout your conversation, and again, somewhere in your articles, you mentioned this, that leaders need to learn how to switch from this like mode of trying to control to then encourage and educate about good decision making process, which then can and will lead towards the outcome that we seek in terms of whether that's feedback, decision making, or certain uh, I guess processes and innovation running in a certain way. And I want to ask you a question that I also am often asked, and I'm not sure I have the answer, and I wanted to ask you that as well. With all the AI happening, leaders feel like, yes, they need to delegate more and they need to give more decision-making power, but they're not sure that junior sort of members of the team can make those decisions because they don't have that vast experience that leaders usually accumulate as they move up the ladder. And they're wondering, like, how can we delegate if we're not sure if they're capable of the quality decisions? Like, what's your take on that? How maybe leaders can work around that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things there. The first is that as people gain more context and as they gain more practice, they will get better at it. The second is that this is not a binary situation. This is not like a dial that has two settings, 0 or 1, delegating or not
Hmm.
delegating. Really thinking about how we can take the next step towards more delegated, more decentralized decision making, and thinking about the leader's own level of comfort there as well. Like if where I want to be 15 steps from now is at this place where decisions that look like this, that, and the other are all decentralized and these kinds of things, like what is the next step that I as a leader am ready to take right now? What's
Hmm.
the the step along the path that feels uncomfortable but just safe enough for me to take?
Hmm.
What is it that I need out of people making those decisions? That's a very like personal introspective question that's incredibly important in order to define an effective path for decentralizing decision making. Which decisions am I comfortable letting go of? And what would I need to know is the case about those decisions in order to feel confident that they're being taken properly? And
Hmm.
that thread, pulling on that, will help to identify which decisions to delegate and what kinds of systems and processes to put in place to ensure that the people to whom those decisions are delegated are positioned to succeed, and that the leader also has the visibility that they need even as they relinquish control.
Yes. I also think, yeah, building on that is you can just also talk to people, meaning ask them, you need to make this decision. Like, what information, what support do I need to be able to be comfortable of making these decisions, right? And then
Yeah,
provide tools and
absolutely.
resources.
Right. So I talked about that from the leader perspective. Like, what does the leader need in order
Hmm.
to be positioned to succeed and to feel comfortable and confident and these kinds of things? But you're absolutely right. Exactly the same thing is true as a mirror image with the people to whom those decisions are being delegated. What is it that they would need in order to be in a position to succeed? What is it that they would need in order to feel comfortable and confident? You know, often we talk about centralization of decision making as though this is something that is in a certain sense, like unilaterally imposed by leaders, and all of the people below wish that they had more decision making authority, and they're just
Mhm.
kind of like they're just waiting to be unleashed to make more decisions. No, there is a lot of like ego risk and professional risk and that's bound up for those employees as well. The system is in such a stable equilibrium state, not only because the leadership is benefiting from and enjoying the setup, but also because the people reporting to that leader are, enjoying it as well. It's like if there's peace everywhere on the terrain, it's because everyone is happy with the setup. If
Yeah.
people were unhappy, if actually they were ready to take on more decisions and they didn't have any reservations about taking on those decisions, you'd have a lot of grumbling and, potentially active warfare here and there.
Yes, again, yeah. People love status quo. People love predictable things. People love things as they are on all levels in all directions. It's not just, yeah, leadership or frontline employees. It goes both ways. And also, I guess what I wanted to mention here is we all have different comfort zone with change and innovation or things being uncertain. And they're always, I found it's beneficial when we find those people also who are more comfortable, who are less comfortable with that. So we could also communicate in a certain way or delegate decision making accordingly to that, right?
Yeah.
Until it all spreads.
We're, I think a lot of people wish that they had more authority, but they're also very comfortable having a lower level of accountability.
Hmm.
So if you offer them both, they might not necessarily take you up on it, right?
Yeah.
You might say, for example, these decisions are now under your control, and then find that you've got a bunch of team members who then come to the leader anyway and say, this is what I'm thinking about, and like basically, how would you make this decision? So
Yes.
in their behavior, they're doing basically exactly the same thing, right? They are looking to make sure that the accountability resides with their leader, even though they've been given the authority. And so at the end of the day, the actual decision making process doesn't change that much. So this is where asking that question about like, well, what do you need to succeed? And what is it that
Hmm.
you need to feel confident and to feel like safe in making these decisions? That's an important question because otherwise you're very likely to have people running back to exactly the same kind of accountability sinks that they were seeking before. They don't want to be the ones to wear a bad outcome. So
Yeah.
if you don't give them clarity about how outcomes will be assessed and these kinds of things, in their behavior, they will probably revert to something very similar to the situation that you're in now. Whereas if you want substantial change, there's more that needs to happen in terms of system redesign as opposed to just delegating authorities to different people.
Yes, I remember, this reminds me of a couple of talks I gave at Innovation Day in companies. And innovation people are actually my favorite people. And I would come to those talks and the leader would tell me, well, here is your space. And I'm like, what do I do here? Do you think? Right. And
Innovate.
exactly. But I think like when you work, I don't know what's your experience, but my experience, when you work with well set up with people who are a good match for innovation department, they're those kind of people. They are okay with giving you responsibility, but they also expect you to take full accountability and responsibility for the freedom that you've been given. So yeah, I just found it very fascinating that there is such a difference because when I went to other events, they're like, yeah, this is the process. You need to do this, and that.
Yeah,
Um,
to that point, I want to share an anecdote about when I also was participating in an innovation day for a client, and I was giving them a bit of training on design thinking and integrating behavioral science into design and these kinds of things for them to think about as they undertake more innovation initiatives. And as we walked through the process and the outcome of the half day workshop was like, well, here's a very, very rough MVP prototype.
mhm.
And then the people in the session asked me, like, oh, well, what do we do with these prototypes? Who do we show them to? How do we actually test them? Like, we need time for this. We need some resources. We need access to some clients to at least put it in front of people and get some reactions. And I said, well, that is an entire like innovation kind of ecosystem setup that requires policies and practices and budgets and these kinds of things. And they said, well, I don't think we have that. And I said, my response was, it's typically the job of someone who has a title like VP of Innovation to
Hmm.
own and curate that ecosystem. And the
Yeah.
people looked around the room and they looked at each other and said, we have a VP of Innovation and he doesn't do anything like that.
Yeah, so it's in every company also reminds me that it's different. You can't assume that it works the same way in every innovation
Yeah,
department. So, yeah, it's life, reminds me. Yeah, you plan, you theorize, but very often life is nothing but something different.
yeah. I mean,
Brooke,
I think it was
go
Mike
ahead.
Tyson, right, who said, "Is everybody has a plan until you get punched
Yeah.
in the face." Yeah,
Yeah, so what I also learned, assume as little as possible and go into any situation with an open mind, prepared to take it either way. And I feel like
right.
these days it's more needed than ever when you literally don't know which way it's gonna go. And so you don't want to put all of your things in one basket.
Right. So I would want to pick up on that and say, yes, I absolutely agree that we need to go in with an open mind and not knowing how things are going to play out. And also, I still believe that plan beats no plan. Like,
Oh,
go in with a plan and the openness to say, the plan is probably wrong, but the process of having built a plan and having a base case to start from is actually extremely helpful. Even if on the very first day, the first step that we take, we put our foot in a ditch and say, oh, actually, no, this was wrong. We need to adjust it in this way. That is such a more helpful conversation to be able to have with people that we have some practice planning with compared
yeah.
to, well, now people are just walking in different directions and we're going to see what happens.
Yeah, I guess what I also meant is now have a plan and maybe have multiple plans. I also advise always to have pre-mortem, like what if the worst case happens? What are we gonna do then? And how can we make sure that actually the worst case maybe doesn't happen all that much, right? And we actually put more effort into designing the ecosystem so the best case scenario has more chance to happen.
I totally agree. And this is something that I often find when I'm talking to people about scenario planning.
Hmm.
People, when I've run scenario planning exercises and when I've talked to people about scenario planning exercises, their initial assumption is often that the purpose of the exercise is to get it right. It's to
Mm.
actually guess what the world is going to be like in 25 years. And actually, that's not the purpose at all. The purpose is to illustrate a range of potential futures and to plan for those potential futures to be able to identify like what are the right moves what are the moves that are smart moves to make regardless of which of these scenarios we end up in, and also to build the muscles of having those kinds of conversations with people about like where do we think this is heading based on the information that we've just seen, and if it were heading in that direction, what action would we need to take? And given that we're not sure yet whether that's the direction that it's heading or whether it's, 15 degrees east of there or whatever, like what are the leading indicators that we should be collecting? How can we go and like prod the world to create the evidence that's necessary to tell us whether we're on one trajectory or a second
Yeah.
trajectory?
Yes, that is, so true. This case scenario planning and preparing the ecosystem and the resources and structures, that is so powerful. I think, as we're going to the end of this podcast, a couple of questions. Well, one question I wanted definitely you to maybe share your take on, maybe some practical tools is with AI now here to stay, and it's definitely accelerating everything and changing a lot of things. What would you say are the main difference in terms of that strategic planning, maybe case scenario planning, and in terms of just approaching change management and change leadership? What's different and what not so different?
Right. So one of the things that I would say is that this technology is being deployed very, very quickly. And that's a way in which it's different from previous technological changes. Somewhere there's a graph that you should share with your readers that talks about like the speed of adoption of new
Mm-hmm.
technologies. And it's specifically like, what is the time delay between the technology being introduced and 50% of the population having adopted it? So, like, from the time that the radio was invented to the time when half of the population had a radio was a
Mm-hmm.
certain number of years. The television, shorter. Like, telephones, well, cellular phones, shorter. Smartphones, shorter. Like, AI is similarly having a very, very short adoption curve. The time from like a public release launch to 50% of the population using it is very, very short. So that's one piece to consider, is that it's
Mm-hmm.
happening quickly. The second is that the most obvious applications of AI are the ones that are really only focused on efficiency, but not changing what it is that you offer or how it is that you operate.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, those applications are the ones to really, from a strategic perspective, it's those applications that are really the ones worth focusing on. People tend to overestimate how much change is possible in the short term and underestimate how much change is possible in the long term. I think what I'm seeing right now is that many leaders are very excited about the efficiency gains that they can get with AI, basically with the mindset that the fundamental model of what value they deliver and how that gets created and delivered is not going to
Mm-hmm.
change. They're very excited about that. And I think that there's often disappointment there. There's disappointment because, in fact, it's not like the gains are not as large as advertised, and they're not nearly as easy as advertised. The change takes more time than people expect. On the flip side, I think that what we'll see in the longer term is that the profound structural changes that come from AI native organizations or organizations that can be really, really aggressive is the wrong word, really ambitious in how deeply they're rethinking the way that their organization functions and how they interact, how they create value for their clientele.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who are really ambitious and go deep in rethinking that will see transformations that are like breathtaking, that are completely upending very established verticals in industry and this kind of thing, and in the public policy sphere as well, like really deeply rethinking how it is that a government serves its people. Like this will have profound and transformational impacts. It's not going to happen in the short term. It's going to take longer than people expect. It's going to take longer than people hope. But being ready for the world in several years to be, in some ways, unrecognizable from the way that it is right now.
Oh,
So, those are a couple of things. Anything else you wanted to ask about around AI?
I've not so much, to be honest, it's so much you can talk about. For I think for another episode we could talk about AI, and there is so much information already that I believe,
Mm,
listeners can like talk about technical stuff. I think I just want to emphasize, you started talking about strategy, and I believe having strategy is an essential part of success if organization truly want to sort of reimagine the future. Because for me, strategy was always like who you are, what do you stand for, and how do you deliver value. And then
right.
also, and then think about AI as a tool that will help you to, as you mentioned, to reimagine the process that you deliver that value. It's like, this upskilling problem. People are like, well, how do we upskill people if we don't know what's going to happen? Well, what's the value of this specific like organization? And what's the value of this specific function, right? Wow.
Right.
Not in terms of technology, like we write more emails or answer more calls, but what is the actual value? What is the problem you're solving? And I think that that's where strategic piece also becomes so relevant and so important. As long as you understand like the North Star, what it is you're trying to do there, that's where you can reimagine. Well, maybe we don't need to write those emails and try to write 100 more of them, right? And should do
Yeah.
something instead.
And to your question earlier, like how do we upskill people if we don't know where things are going? How can we how can we do a reorganization if we don't know where things are going? How can we build a strategy? How can we build culture if we don't know where things are going? Like those are often asked as rhetorical questions, but I want to take
Mm-hmm.
them seriously. And I want to say, like, actually, the clue to answering those questions is right there in the question itself. How do we upskill people if we don't know where things are going? Help them to build skills to figure out how to adapt to change.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
everything's going to be changing, then skills for change are going to be at a premium. Your organizational structure, again, organize for change. That is going to be at a premium. Your culture around learning and testing, that is going to be at a premium. Your strategy and how it is that you make bets about different ways to serve different clientele, like organize your strategy around change. These questions are often asked, again, in a rhetorical way, as a way
Exactly.
to, in a certain sense, like throw up your hands and say,
Yeah.
well, there's nothing we can do. But actually, no, there is
Yeah.
something that you can do. It's to organize around change and to organize around uncertainty. Those are very, very powerful things.
Yeah, powerful things and skills that you can actually train people for, just like Navy SEALs you mentioned or Marines, they do it all the time. Help people to learn how to operate in the environment of volatility and uncertainty and predictability. So they can do
Yeah,
it, everyone can do it with their organization. And you're so right. Yeah, it's a rhetorical question, but it has the answer. Brooke, thank you so much for all this information. Again, I could talk to you about that for hours, 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 and there is so much to unpack in every sentence that you give, any the answer and any piece of insight. So thank you so much. But I invite listeners to go and explore more of your work of decision lab, the convergence, right? I read a few articles but haven't explored fully what it is you offer there. So maybe can you give our listeners a list of why would they want to explore your work, what kind of services they can get, and where they should go
sure.
to explore and connect with you?
Sure. So yeah, the company that I launched 3 years ago is called Converge. People can find us at convergehere.com. And the services that I'm offering are transformation facilitation services. So helping organizations with strategic transformations and cultural transformations. And they're the kinds of clients that I'm working with are leaders who recognize that change really needs to begin with them. So we've
Hmm.
talked quite a bit throughout our
Yeah.
conversation about the importance of personal growth in this journey. It's recognizing that if I want different outcomes, I need to change the system. And as a leader, one of the biggest determinants of why the system operates the way that it does and why the system is set up is the way that it is because of my decisions and my behavior and the behavior of my leadership team around me. And so the way that I'm helping organizations is through accompanying their leadership groups through the process of designing new strategies, through the process of overhauling their culture or renovating
Hmm.
their culture, to borrow a phrase from Kevin Oakes. So that's the kind of work that I'm doing. I've also recently launched a keynote and workshop offering. So something that I've seen in the last few months is that with all of the socio-political, socioeconomic changes that we're seeing, organizations have really struggled to commit to bigger transformations. And I think that there's some wisdom in there, to the point that we've been discussing, like, how do I figure out where to go if things seem to be changing so much? We need
Yeah.
to do strategy a bit faster. In response to that, I've put together a keynote and workshop offering, which is really oriented towards organizations that are just starting to consider change and
Hmm.
starting to think through, like, are we ready for change? What kind of change are we thinking about? What is the urgency? I asked these two questions, like, what is it about the status quo that wouldn't be acceptable to continue for the next 18 or 24
Yeah.
months? That's exactly what this new, smaller offering is about. It's helping organizations just to start scratching that surface of, like, what is the change that we might be ready for? And how can we set the table for this deeper transformation before we dive in? Because people are skittish about diving in with 2 feet.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. So it's all on your website, right? Convergehere.com.
Yep. So all
Okay.
of the information about the offerings is there. We also have our media page there, so that's where you can
Hmm.
find all the thought leadership work. This podcast will eventually be featured there as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, really, I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you inviting me, and I hope that listeners get a lot out of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brooke. We'll link this in the show notes and also a little bit more information about you. So I invite listeners to check it out, connect with you, learn from you, and also stay tuned for future episodes of Change Wired podcast. Thank you, Brooke, for being such an amazing guest on the show.
Thanks for having me.